September 12th, 1944. Outside Mons, Belgium. The rain had not stopped for 2 days, turning the fields into a sucking gray paste that clung to boots, treads, and the faces of the men moving through it. Private First Class Daniel Mercer of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division brushed a sleeve across his eyes, pushing away the mixture of rain and exhaust drifting from the idling M4A3 Sherman behind him. The tank's engine rumbled like a caged beast, steam rising from its vents as warm metal met cold rain. On the road ahead, a long column of surrendered Wehrmacht troops, some Panzer crewmen still wearing their black wrap tunics, shuffled under the watchful eyes of American MPs. Their helmets hung low, more in exhaustion than in shame. Mercer noticed one of them, a gaunt Obergefreiter, maybe 22, grease still under his fingernails, staring at the Sherman with a look that wasn't fear, but confusion. The German's eyes followed the tank like someone studying a magician. Then he muttered something to the soldier next to him. Mercer couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Disbelief. And this was happening across the Western Front. Captured panzer crews, mechanics, and armored officers were beginning to see things Germany had never prepared them for. Not on the battlefield, but behind it. Tanks arriving faster than they could be destroyed, Shermans rolling off landing crafts by the dozens, spare parts appearing in crates before crews even asked for them. For Germany, tank warfare had long been built around craftsmanship. Each Panzer III, each Panther, each Tiger was born from specialized factories, skilled engineers, and slow, deliberate processes. Their tanks were often technically superior, but they were built like fine automobiles, precision machines requiring time, attention, and scarce materials. As early as 1941, German production already struggled to keep pace with losses. By 1944, it had become a mathematical impossibility. The battlefield only made the disparity more obvious. In Normandy, American armored units had suffered losses, sometimes heavy ones. But replacement vehicles arrived so quickly that many battalions reported being back to full operational strength within days. By contrast, Panzer divisions often received replacements months late, or not at all. German crews in Normandy began noticing a pattern. No matter how many Shermans they knocked out, more came. In some engagements, it seemed as though the Americans had infinite reserves. The Wehrmacht explained it away with propaganda, until the POW cages began filling with armored crewmen who had time to observe the truth firsthand. They watched as American officers logged captured equipment using standardized forms. They listened as tank transporters rumbled past carrying new Shermans still smelling of fresh paint. They saw maintenance depots repairing tanks with an ease they found almost surreal. To men who had been raised on the myth of German mechanical supremacy, the sight was humiliating and impossible. Germany could not even replace a handful of Panthers without delays, shortages, or factory disruptions. Yet here the Americans were, treating tanks almost like consumable equipment. Then came the statistic that shattered their understanding of the war. Somewhere between the Belgian mud and the temporary POW pens near Liège, word spread among the captured crews. In the United States, converted automobile plants were producing tanks faster than Germany produced cars. Even more unbelievable, Ford's Willow Run plant, originally built for cars, was producing a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Not a bolt, not a fuselage section, a whole 4-engine warplane. The reactions ranged from disbelief to outright shock. Some thought it was Allied propaganda, others quietly feared it was true. Because if America could build aircraft like cars, then tanks were nothing. And as the POWs marched deeper into Allied lines, the magnitude of American industry began to slowly reveal itself. They saw fields filled with fuel drums stacked higher than trucks. They watched endless convoys of spare parts, ammunition, and rations flowing forward like a tide. They realized the mathematics of war had shifted against them long before their capture. Germany had built excellent tanks. America had built an unstoppable system. By the time the German tank crews reached the next holding area, the rain easing into a cold mist, Mercer overheard the same Obergefreiter whisper to another POW. "If they build tanks like automobiles." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every man in the line understood what it meant. Because on this muddy, gray morning in Belgium, one truth became painfully clear to them all. Germany had lost long before its tanks ran out, because its factories already had. As the POW convoy rolled deeper into Allied-controlled territory, the once defiant confidence of the German armored crews grew quieter. The Obergefreiter, who had stared so long at the Sherman, now kept his eyes low, not out of fear, but from the realization settling painfully into his mind. The war he fought on the battlefield had never been the war America fought in its factories. It was a revelation that only intensified once the prisoners arrived at a temporary processing camp near Namur. The camp itself was unremarkable. Tents, barbed wire, a few rows of wooden benches, but the equipment around it was staggering. Rows of Studebaker and GMC trucks idled nearby, part of the logistical arteries feeding Patton's relentless advance eastward. Mechanics moved among them with casual efficiency, replacing spark plugs, fitting new tires, checking fluid levels. Tasks performed with the speed of a pit crew. One German Panzer mechanic, a Feldwebel named Karl Brenner, watched the scene with growing unease. Back home, German tank depots were slow, under-resourced, and constantly short on spare parts. A single damaged Panzer IV might wait weeks for a transmission, a new road wheel, or even basic lubricants. Here, however, American vehicles seemed to receive whatever they needed instantly, as if the parts grew from the earth. And then Brenner noticed something that shook him more than any battlefield defeat. A supply sergeant, barely older than 20, was filling out a form on a clipboard. The form had a box for every part number, every maintenance action, every unit code. Every truck had multiple copies of the same paperwork. The Germans had seen efficiency before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a motor pool. It was a system. A machine running within a machine. A U.S. captain, overhearing some of the POWs whisper, offered a simple explanation to a British liaison officer. Detroit figured out how to build tanks like Model Ts. Once you standardize, everything gets faster. The Germans understood the words. What they couldn't understand was the scale. Because back in late 1941, when America had first committed itself to rearmament, its auto factories had not simply shifted production, they had reinvented it. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant, the largest industrial building in the world at the time, was designed with a single objective: turn aircraft production into an assembly line process. No nation had attempted such a thing. Britain still relied on multiple small factories to build fighters. Germany depended on specialized, labor-intensive manufacturing. Japan struggled to produce even basic components. America automated it. Willow Run was 3.5 million square feet of concrete, glass, and machinery. It had over a mile of moving assembly line. Workers, many of them women new to industrial labor, stood along the endless conveyor systems, installing wing spars, fitting engines, and bolting down gun turrets with mechanical precision. The sheer scale made the German concept of Meisterarbeit, master craftsmanship, seem almost quaint. And while Willow Run assembled B-24 Liberators at record speeds, Chrysler took over tank production in Detroit Arsenal. By 1942, the United States was producing more armored vehicles annually than all Axis nations combined. In 1943, Detroit Arsenal alone produced over 8,000 tanks. In the same year, Germany produced fewer than 6,000. POWs didn't need to see the factories themselves to understand. They saw it in front of them, in the endless rows of supply crates stacked on pallets. They saw it in the way American tank crews replaced a bogey wheel in minutes. They saw it in the way mechanics used standardized tools, standardized bolts, even standardized paint cans. Everything fit. Everything matched. Everything arrived on time. One captured Panther gunner, a young soldier from the 2nd Panzer Division, muttered under his breath, "Our tanks were better, but they were alone." He wasn't wrong. German engineering produced marvels. The Panther's sloped armor, the Tiger's fearsome 80mm 36 gun. Yet these machines were fragile giants. Complex transmissions broke down. Replacement engines were scarce. Field repairs required skilled mechanics Germany no longer had. Meanwhile, American Shermans, simpler, lighter, easier to build, emerged in endless waves. They were not invincible, but they were omnipresent. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more arrived. For every tank battalion mauled, fresh replacements followed. In the Ardennes, Patton's divisions maneuvered with a confidence born not merely of training, but of certainty. Supplies would come. This was the human element Germany never realized it was fighting against. Not a single innovator, not a single breakthrough, but the combined intellect of thousands of engineers, machinists, and factory workers. People the German crews would never see, but whose presence they now felt in every crate, every vehicle, every standardized part. The POWs sat around the campfires at night, exchanging quiet words. Many had believed the war would turn on battles, on tactics, on the superiority of design. Now they discussed conveyors, toolings, and die presses, subjects no soldier expected to debate. Because the moment of insight had arrived. Germany was not losing to better tanks. It was losing to better manufacturing. And as the POWs absorbed this truth, another, even more unsettling realization waited just ahead. One that would emerge when they finally learned what America's factories had truly achieved. The revelation spread quietly among the captured crews, but the true shock came days later, when a U.S. intelligence officer, an older major with a calm voice and an encyclopedic knowledge of production statistics, gave a routine briefing to a group of POWs scheduled for transport to England. It was not meant as humiliation. The Allies had learned that many German soldiers, especially technical specialists, were more cooperative when simply told the truth. The major unfolded a small clipboard and read numbers as casually as if he were listing grocery items. "Detroit Arsenal," he began. "One of our tank plants produced more armored vehicles in 1943 than Germany and Japan combined. We're not even running all shifts yet." Some POWs exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked away. Then the major added, almost offhand, "Ford's Willow Run plant is currently putting out 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. It was as if the air itself changed. A few POWs chuckled, dry, disbelieving laughs. One whispered that it was impossible. Another shook his head, eyes narrowing in suspicion. But a handful of mechanics, the ones who understood factories, lowered their gazes. They knew the truth the moment they heard the speed. 63 minutes. Not for a component, not for an airframe section, for an entire four-engine bomber. For German POWs, this was not a statistic. It was a death sentence for the industrial war they thought they understood. Panzer crewman Feldwebel Karl Brenner felt his stomach sink. At the height of the war, Germany had struggled to build even 3 or 4 aircraft per day in many factories. Skilled labor was stretched thin. Allied bombing mangled supply chains. Complex designs slowed production. Yet here, the Americans had created a process where aircraft rolled off a line like sausages from a machine. The breakthrough was finally clear. America had not just mobilized its industry, it had weaponized it. And nowhere was that more evident than in the way tanks appeared on the front lines. A week after the briefing, Brenner and his fellow POWs were marched to a rail station. As they waited, a long flat-car train rumbled past them, heading toward the front. 20 Sherman tanks sat chained to it, their hulls uniformly painted, their turrets all set at the same traverse angle. They looked identical, interchangeable in a way no German tank ever could be. To the Germans, tanks were individual beasts. No 2 Panthers were exactly the same. Even the Tigers, revered for their engineering, varied from vehicle to vehicle. Maintenance crews cursed mismatched components. Welders fought irregular armor plates. Field units struggled constantly with parts that didn't quite fit. Yet here rolled a train of Shermans that looked like they had been stamped from a mold. A young underofficer, previously a Panther loader, muttered, "This is not war. This is production." He was right. And the effects of that production were already reshaping the battlefield. In Normandy, American armored divisions had replaced losses at speeds unobtainable by the Wehrmacht. After Operation Cobra, U.S. commanders reported receiving enough tanks to refill entire battalions in days. During the drive across France, some armored units had so many replacement vehicles that they began rotating crews into fresh tanks, purely to reduce breakdowns. To German eyes, this contradicted everything they believed about war. Their own replacements arrived in trickles, sometimes a single Tiger to fill the gap of 10 destroyed tanks. Fuel shortages forced Panzer crews to abandon perfectly functional vehicles. Spare transmissions were so scarce that some Panthers became immobile bunkers. But America treated tanks like consumables. This was the moment when German POWs truly grasped the consequence of American industrial planning. Tanks were no longer symbols of strength. They were logistics items. Shermans did not need to be individually superior. They needed to arrive. And they arrived everywhere. When German officers were later interrogated in England, many expressed the same shock. They believed American tank production had doubled what their intelligence estimates predicted. In reality, it was several times higher. U.S. factories produced over 49,000 Shermans, over 18,000 tank destroyers, tens of thousands of tracked and armored support vehicles, all built with interchangeable parts, all supported by a supply network that delivered everything from engines to rations with mechanical regularity. This was more than a breakthrough. It was a turning point in the philosophy of war. The Germans had built weapons. The Americans had built a system to feed the battlefield forever. One POW lieutenant summed it up perfectly in a post-war interview. "We built tanks to last. The Americans built tanks to replace." That difference, simple, efficient, and relentless, was the hinge upon which the armored war in Europe would turn. And soon, the prisoners would see how this industrial tide transformed entire campaigns, swallowing up the last hopes of Germany's armored forces. By the autumn of 1944, the thunder of American industry no longer echoed only in distant factories. It slammed directly into the German front lines, reshaping battles in ways the Panzerwaffe could neither predict nor resist. For captured tank crews, the shock of America's assembly line armor became brutally clear as they learned what their comrades were facing on the battlefield. The turning point was not a single clash, but a pattern, repeated, consistent, and devastating. At Aricourt in September 1944, German armored formations encountered U.S. tank battalions that were not only well-led and well-supplied, but seemingly unbreakable in their ability to regenerate combat power. German intelligence had expected exhausted American units, short on fuel, ammunition, and tanks after the rapid advance from Normandy. Instead, they ran into battalions freshly topped off with Shermans that had arrived overnight on flat cars, unloaded, fueled, and sent into the fight by morning. Generalleutnant Hasso von Manteuffel later admitted that the Americans' ability to replace their losses almost instantly shocked him more than their tactics. At Aricourt, German armored divisions lost over 80 tanks. U.S. losses were a fraction of that, and most of those Shermans were replaced within days. That kind of resilience was beyond anything the Panzerwaffe could match. But no battle demonstrated the power of American industrial might more clearly than the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final gamble, launched on December 16, 1944. The plan relied on the same flawed assumption that had haunted German strategic thinking since 1942, that the enemy, overwhelmed with casualties and supply strain, would not be able to respond fast enough. Hitler's generals whispered the same hope. They cannot replace what they lose. But the United States could, and did. When German armored spearheads slammed into thin American lines, they achieved rapid gains. Yet even as U.S. units were forced back, the first reinforcements were already on their way. Entire armored divisions redeployed in days. Fresh Sherman companies rolled in from depots as though summoned from thin air. Tank transporters streamed east toward the Ardennes in unbroken columns. Mechanized maintenance battalions repaired damaged tanks in conditions that would have paralyzed German workshops. The Panzer divisions, by contrast, entered the offensive already crippled by shortages. Some Tigers began the assault with underfilled fuel tanks. Panthers carried limited ammunition. Many units lacked spare tracks or road wheels. When these tanks were knocked out, they stayed knocked out. But for the Americans, a crippled Sherman might return to battle within hours or be replaced by a new one entirely. During the height of the fighting near Bastogne, U.S. armored units suffered losses that would have destroyed German divisions. Yet each dawn, more Shermans appeared. Fresh Hellcats and tank destroyers arrived. M10 crews received replacement vehicles as fast as German gunners could destroy them. German POWs processed after the Ardennes campaign repeatedly expressed the same disbelief. We destroyed tanks all day. At night, they were back. It was impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was assembly line logic. The turning point came in late December, when German commanders realized they had no hope of replacing their losses. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Panthers abandoned for lack of gasoline were found intact by American infantry, but unusable, their logistics lifeline severed days earlier. Meanwhile, U.S. trucks delivered tens of thousands of gallons of fuel daily, even under Luftwaffe harassment. In the final days of the offensive, as German armor sputtered out, Patton's Third Army counterattacked with a force that stunned even Allied observers. Fresh Sherman battalions, brand new from depots, engines humming, treads shining with factory paint. These were not survivors of earlier battles. They were new tools, produced by a nation that had already accepted the industrial cost of victory. The effect on German morale was catastrophic. When Obergefreiter Josef Kappel, formerly of the 9th Panzer Division, reached his POW camp in January 1945, he reportedly stared at the rows of parked Sherman tanks surrounding the American staging area and whispered, "They arrive faster than we can kill them." The mathematics of war had finally become undeniable. A Panther, though deadly, took nearly twice as many man-hours to build as a Sherman. A Tiger required almost 3 times more steel and 4 times more labor. German factories, bombed and fractured, could no longer sustain such burdens. The Panzerwaffe was bleeding out faster than production could replace it. But the Americans? They were hitting their production stride. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 17 million tons of steel, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Its auto plants, once idle during the Depression, now operated around the clock. Conveyor belts moved like arteries. Pumping tanks onto flat cars bound for both coasts. The industrial tide had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. It wasn't superior tactics that crushed the Panzerwaffe. It wasn't superior firepower. It wasn't even the numerical advantage alone. It was a nation that had treated war like a manufacturing project. By the time the German POWs crossed the Channel toward England, their understanding of the campaign had changed forever. They had not been defeated in a duel of machines. They had been drowned in an ocean of production capacity larger than anything they had imagined. And soon, they would come to understand the full legacy of this system, one that would shape not only the end of the war, but the entire military order of the next century. As the POW transports sailed across the Channel toward England, the captured German tank crews sat in silence. Some staring at the steel bulkheads, others at the dark water beyond the portholes. The journey itself was uneventful, but the mental journey they had undergone since their capture was profound. They had come face to face with a truth their commanders had never fully revealed to them. The war had not been decided solely on the battlefield. It had been decided in the factories, the foundries, the rail yards, and the assembly lines of a nation whose industrial power had been underestimated from the beginning. When the POWs were processed in British camps, Allied interrogators were careful not to taunt or demean them. Instead, they answered questions with honesty. How many tanks America built? How many trucks? How many engines? How much fuel the U.S. shipped across the Atlantic every week? The interrogators spoke not with triumph, but with practicality, because for them, this was simply how a modern war had to be fought. Some German officers asked to see the numbers themselves. They were shown charts, graphs, even copies of U.S. War Production Board reports. And nearly every time, the reaction was the same: disbelief giving way to resignation. In one recorded interrogation, a staff officer from the Panzer Lehr Division stared for a long moment at a chart showing U.S. tank production from 1942 to 1944. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "We never fought this. We only fought its shadow." For many of these men, the legacy of the war began to take shape, not in defeat, but in understanding. They realized that the German doctrine they had trusted, the doctrine built on quality over quantity, craftsmanship over standardization, had been rendered obsolete by a new philosophy. Warfare had entered the industrial age. And in the industrial age, the nation that could build the most, move the most, and replace the most would dominate the battlefield. The war ended in May 1945, but the legacy of America's wartime production continued to reverberate across the world. The United States emerged as the undisputed industrial giant of the century. Its factories, once converted to build tanks and bombers, returned to automobile production with a speed that astonished observers. Assembly line principles refined during the war became the backbone of post-war industry. The mobility, logistics, and standardization that defined the U.S. Army in 1944 to 45 laid the foundations for the mechanized doctrine of NATO. Meanwhile, Germany, shattered and divided, studied the lessons of its defeat. Post-war German industry rebuilt itself with efficiency in mind, adopting production systems far closer to the American model than the pre-war one. In the decades ahead, the German automotive and engineering industries would become world leaders, not by rejecting assembly line logic, but by mastering it. Historians would later note that the tank battles of World War II were not simply duels of firepower and armor. They were duels of supply chains, replacement rates, and the capacity of nations to maintain mechanized armies across continents. Even the famed German tanks, the Tiger, the Panther, came to be understood differently. They were engineering masterpieces, yes, but strategically flawed. Their complexity made them difficult to produce, maintain, and repair. Their quality, ironically, limited their quantity. The Sherman, by contrast, carried a different legacy. It was not the best tank of the war, but it was the best tank built for the war America actually fought. A war of logistics, endurance, and relentless forward movement. Its story became a case study in how clarity of purpose, mass production, and standardization could overcome technically superior opponents. In the decades that followed, military academies around the world taught these lessons. Students learned that industrial capacity was itself a strategic weapon. Generals studied the U.S. logistics system as carefully as they studied battles like Kursk or El Alamein. Engineers analyzed Willow Run as much as they analyzed battlefield after-action reports. And economists pointed to the American wartime mobilization as one of the greatest examples of national coordination in history. For the German POWs, who had once stared in confusion at the endless rows of Shermans, this legacy was bittersweet. Many returned home after the war to work in factories rebuilt from rubble. Some became engineers, others mechanics. A few even admitted, years later, that what they saw in American supply depots and maintenance yards had inspired them. They had glimpsed the future, one where industry, not ideology, would shape the destiny of nations. And in that sense, their disbelief in 1944 had been more than shock. It had been recognition. Recognition that they were witnessing a turning point not just in the war, but in the history of modern conflict. The Americans had learned how to build tanks faster than their opponents could destroy them. Their industry had become a battlefield weapon, a force multiplier greater than armor thickness or gun caliber. And that lesson would echo through every major conflict that followed. The story of German POWs staring in awe at American tanks was not just a wartime anecdote. It was a symbol of a deeper truth. In the industrial war of the 20th century, victory belonged to the nation that turned factories into front lines. And if you want more World War II stories like this, cinematic, accurate, and built for long-form storytelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next deep dive into the untold history of the Second World War.